This is Alexander Szikla, and today we're going to be talking about strategies for South Korea. This is part of my independent research for the Des Hotels McGill Hot Cities of the World Tour, where we'll be visiting Seoul, South Korea, and Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia this year. Our agenda is as follows. We're going to be talking about the history of the modern Korean state from a geopolitical perspective. We'll talk about the history of Korean industrialism, the current situation and the key issues faced by Korea's economy, as well as recommendations on how the Korean economy can get over these hurdles, as well as if there are any possible transferable lessons for Mongolia. In 1910, the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed by both Japan and Korea, which extended Japanese imperial rule to Korea up until the end of World War II. Then during World War II in November of 1943 at the Cairo Conference, the Allied powers agreed to the following clause, quote, "It was agreed that in due course Korea shall become free and independent," end quote. During World War II in February of 1945 at the Yalta Conference, the Allied powers established a four-power trusteeship over Korea. This included the US, Soviet Union, Britain, and China. In 1945, towards the end of World War II, Soviet tanks entered northern Korea from Siberia, meeting little resistance. 6 days later, the Japanese surrendered to Allied forces. In 1948, as the Cold War escalated, two separate nations were established, and the UN recognized the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as the sole legal government of Korea. In 1950, the Korean War breaks out when North Korea breached the 38th parallel line to invade South Korea. This ended any hope of peaceful reunification. In 1987 up until present day, Korea has transitioned towards a market-oriented democracy after decades of oppressive autocratic governments that were supported by the United States. The history of Korean industrialism is as follows. Up until the mid-20th century, Korea's economy was relatively small and agrarian. In 1961, President Park Chung-hee, a former general of the army and the father of the current Korean president, became the third president of South Korea when the military took over the government. He introduced economic plans to spur rapid industrialization and promote large businesses. This led to the rise of chaebals. Chaebals are basically business conglomerates that are typically global multinationals, owning numerous international enterprises, which are often family-owned as well. Chaebals were guaranteed loans from the banking sector as well as government investment. This led to the rise of an export-oriented economy and a phenomenon of guided capitalism throughout South Korea. It's amazing to see how the Korean economy moved under chaebals from agrarian to producing wigs and textiles, then moving on to heavy industry, chemical industry, and import substitution industries, and finally moving into the present day where they manufacture electronics and tech. In 1988, Chung Moong-joon, the president of Hyundai Heavy Industries, often chose members of the National Assembly through proportional representation. This marked the beginning of Korean business and government being intertwined, where chaebol families would often have representation in their National Assembly and in the political scene overall. In 1997, the Asian financial crisis began when the Thai baht collapsed and contagion spread throughout Asian economies. The export-oriented business found within the four tiger economies of Asia were neglected. They neglected the domestic economy, and chaebols began collapsing. This included Daewoo, for example. Throughout the four tiger economies, high leverage was required for growth, but this high leverage exacerbated the issue and helped the collapse worsen. In 2000, though, going on the same lines of Hyundai's involvement with politics in Korea, Hyundai played a role, up until today, has been playing a role in thawing North Korean and South Korean tensions. So the current situation is as follows. Korea is the 12th largest economy in the world. They engage in shipbuilding, manufacture of LCD screens, mobile handsets, and memory chips. They rank as number 12 on the HDI index, higher than countries such as Denmark, France, Finland, and the United Kingdom, and Korea is also the 5th largest automaker. There are 5 key issues I've identified that the Korean economy faces, and they all relate to one another. At the core is the underdeveloped financial sector found in Korea. This has led to a shrinking middle class and resistance towards developing a services-oriented economy. Now, at the base of these issues, towards the bottom, are issues that are related but are culturally ingrained. For example, Koreans are known to have a risk-aversive culture, and there are still gender inequality issues throughout Korea. Now we can see that Korea's financial services sector is greatly underdeveloped, both with regards to productivity and their employment share. Now, insurance, real estate, telecom, most people are employed in these industries throughout Korea. As far as their public services, such as healthcare and education, the Koreans do an excellent job at providing these services, very productive. However, professional services such as business support services, IT services, and architectural and engineering services really score low on both axes, both productivity and employment share. Now, financial services are included among these, and Korea really has to develop its financial services sector to advance. Korean home loans are a great example of this. They have short durations of only 10 years compared to 15 or 30 years in North America. They have floating rates as opposed to fixed rates. The average loan-to-value ratio is 51%, which is very high. Compare this to North America, where it's 20%, or even before 2008, where it may have been 0% or negative 10%, where a family could put down no money for their house and get an extra 10% on top of what the house cost to buy furniture for the house or a boat for the weekends. Now, this certainly led to the subprime crisis, and Korea implemented these high loan-to-value ratios to avoid housing bubbles and banking system problems, which worked. As we can see in the graph below, Korea's crash in 2008 was not nearly as bad as those in Canada or the US. The blue line denotes the Korean real estate index. The red and orange lines denote the Canadian and American real estate indexes. Moreover, their immediate recovery in 2009 was far more robust, and looking into the long term, their economy into present day 2013 and 14 was far more robust than the recovery of real estate assets in North America throughout the US or Canada. Now, it's also interesting to show that Korean housing prices are higher relative to their income. In the US, the ratio of house price to income is about 3.5 times, same in Canada at 3.4. The number floats around 6 in Australia and the UK. In Korea, it's 7.7, very high. Moreover, most Korean families have most of their assets in real estate, about 74%, with 26% in other assets, whether that's cash, jewelry, or securities. In the US, that's kind of the inverse, as we have 25% of our assets in real estate and 75% in other assets. Canada is kind of similar, as well as the UK, with 33 and 42%. Most of their assets are in other types of securities or cash or whatever they may be using to store their assets. As well, we can see that South Koreans pay a higher premium for high loan-to-value loans. Now, what I mean by this is that as you go up higher in the LTV brackets, above 60%, there's not much of a change throughout the Netherlands or the United States, where you're covering 60% of the loan with your down payment. In South Korea, however, this increases markedly. Now, this is a problem since high interest rates at floating around 10 or 12% above the 85% or 90% threshold can be really restrictive to middle-class families and cause them to have cash flow constraints. Now, these issues have led to the shrinking Korean middle class. Outside of the costly housing-related expenses, Koreans have an obsession with higher education. 71% of high school graduates go to university. Parents pay outrageous amounts for private schools and tutors so that their children can pass university entrance exams. Now, this causes the middle class to become cash flow constrained, and it actually leads to crowding out of investment that they can use to create a balanced economy between service and goods. Now, it's interesting to know that the net present value of a high school degree and 4 extra years of work experience in Korea is higher than that of a university degree, but it's still taboo to not go to university. So these cash flow constraints and the shrinking middle class has led to low consumption in Korea, low employment growth, and household savings have plunged from 19% to 4%. Granted, a low pool of savings restricts the money supply and raises interest rates even further, which leads to a positive feedback loop that exacerbates the issue even further. Now, as we can see, most developed economies have a very healthy services sector. The US is about 80% with 13% in manufacturing. Japan is on the low end with 73% in services and 20% in manufacturing. Korea is only at 58% for services, 30% for manufacturing. But it's important to note that Korea is actually engaging in a haphazard transition toward services as far fewer workers are hired. The government is not investing in the services sector, and most service jobs are not being created such as in fields such as air transport, engineering, construction. Instead, they're being created in low value added roles like restaurants and small shops. So there's no government support. Most people in the services industry may be waiters or proprietors of a little corner store, and there's a lack of job creation in the professional services sector, as you can see by the two graphs shown below. Now in Korea, as I mentioned, a disproportional amount of jobs are created in the low value added sector, as we can see in the graph below. Most of Korea's economy is attributed towards manufacturing, not services, unlike most other developed economies, which hug to this regression line in the graph here. So clearly Korea has to move beyond manufacturing and move towards a more service-oriented and entrepreneurial culture. But what hinders Korean entrepreneurialism is really that Koreans have a risk-aversive culture. As we can see in the graph below, Korea scores lowest on all 5 of these indicators. Koreans are least interested in entrepreneurship. They perceive opportunity and capability in entrepreneurship as the least likely as compared to other fields. They are not really interested in starting or running businesses, and they really only start or run businesses if they see that they have no alternatives. And this is compared to other Asian economies as well as other developed economies in the West, such as Germany, the UK, and the US. So, outside of the lack of entrepreneurial aspirations, small and medium enterprises are only about 35% as productive as larger companies in Korea. This is due to the fact that there's a high degree of trading between chaebols that limits the available market for small to medium enterprises. Additionally, there are tons of legal issues faced in South Korea. For example, business owners can transfer businesses to children tax-free if the business has operated for at least 10 years. This discourages mergers, and it discourages businesses to take on partners, which is often necessary for growth. Business bankruptcy laws in Korea are akin to personal bankruptcy because they require joint personal guarantees. Government subsidies really encourage the status quo, so weak businesses survive and resources aren't consolidated. So low productivity performers aren't really weeded out, and businesses can't scale up. South Korea really needs to revise their protection for intellectual property and also revise their labor laws, since job turnover is much higher in services than in manufacturing. The rigid labor laws in South Korea raise costs, hurt job creation, and slow innovation. This is why only about 0.07% of SMEs grow to become large enterprises. Another issue preventing the services sector and the economy as a whole in Korea is the fact that gender equality is not really prevalent in Korea, in the sense that most Korean women have lower labor participation rates overall and leave jobs in higher numbers when they begin to raise children, as we can see in the slump in the graph below. During the shaded gray area, which are child-raising years in Korea and childbearing years, Korean women take far lower participation in the workforce than other economies like the United States, Sweden, and Germany. Additionally, highly educated women with at least 4 years of college are even less likely than other women to return to the labor force after child rearing. Women over 30 and mothers return to the labor force are more likely to return to temporary or day work and not full-time work. Now, that's also an issue if Korea really wants to bolster its economy and have diversity among its labor force. At current fertility rates, however, South Korea faces a huge rise in dependency rates from the aging population. Now, due to this impending change in South Korea's demographic pyramid and the fact that it's going to become inverted much like Japan's, women will likely need to begin entering the workforce in order to help the economy grow and support social security and healthcare outflows. But that may not happen until a few years, perhaps 20 years from now. So the recommendations for South Korea are as follows. They need to firstly diversify their financial sector. They can do this by offering long-term fixed-rate mortgages on homes, as well as offering loans to chaebals as well as small businesses that are not from second-tier banks, nor do they have as high interest rates as those currently offered, which is really prohibitive to capital flows. With regards to mortgages, the government can underwrite, insure, or securitize mortgages, much like in Germany or the US. And with regards to vocational training, as I mentioned before, most Koreans go to university, but this has a lower MPV, a lower net present value than going to high school. So Korea should encourage vocational education to boost the middle class and create jobs with lower educational costs, which will lead to higher savings, improve their pool of capital, and bring down interest rates to help Koreans invest in their own economy. This is also going to allow Korea to provide valuable services to its economy and boost the services sector overall. Now, I also recommend that the Korean government directly invest in small and medium enterprises, and they can do this by funding venture capital funds, funding incubators, and funding research and development labs, much like governments such as Israel have done. They can also encourage growth by revising their tax and bankruptcy laws and also protecting intellectual property rights. Moreover, the government can also, or in corporations as well, can develop child care programs to really get women involved in Korea and help them become a part of the workforce, a contributing part of the workforce, especially those women with university degrees who are college educated, because that's just a drain of human capital from the economy. Now, what are the transferable lessons we can learn from Mongolia? First of all, Mongolia should diversify its financial sector from the get-go. Another issue that Mongolia faces is the fact that they don't really allow competition in their financial sector, and they should to bolster their own financial sector and make it as strong as they can. 90% of Mongolia's revenues actually come from mining, so we suggest that they actually diversify their economy overall and start bolstering the services sector as well, so they don't face a issue similar to Korea. Now, Mongolia is an interesting case since it was a former Soviet satellite and has always been a buffer between China and the Soviet Union after the Sino-Soviet split. So they're transitioning from a post-communism mentality, and they really need to begin mirroring Western legal and tax codes in order to help develop their economy. Now, the government also needs to lead investment into goods and services to diversify their economy and their employment base. I touched on this when I talked about finances, since the Mongolian government limits foreign banks, and their internal banking sector is heavily exposed to their resource-rich environment, which is actually facing a slowdown in recent years, both with regards to operations and with regards to a rise in bad loans. So if their financial sector crumbles, they won't be able to continue financing their resource mining, and that's going to lead to a positive feedback loop, creating serious systematic issues throughout Mongolia. However, if they diversify their economy and develop a strong middle class, that won't be an issue. I also think that Mongolia should, from the get-go, develop government programs to train women and help them partake, whether it's in the mining sector or even in service-oriented jobs such as the development of their financial sector, or maybe even in local services such as restaurants or retail, which will probably see a rise in Mongolia over the next 50 years as their middle class emerges. Finally, if you have any questions regarding my presentation, feel free to contact me directly at alexander.szikla@mail.mcgill.ca